So thank you very much for taking part in the two discussion groups that we've had just now. I propose that we spend the next few minutes listening to some feedback from the two groups, which were moderated by Migo and Julia. So we'll give them a few minutes to feedback some of the discussion that was had in the two groups. And we'll then have, as we did yesterday, a bit of a more broad discussion with opportunities for questions and some discussion within the plenary. I think one of my reflections on what we've done over the last 24 hours or so has been that while we often think of other people as living in echo chambers and listening really to what is happening around them, or having some form of selective hearing, I think the opportunity that we've had over the last 24 hours is we've all been to a certain extent, an uncomfortable place. We've all heard things that perhaps we feel uncomfortable with, and I think that's one of the real opportunities here is to share our experience and our viewpoints, and to feel uncomfortable. And I think that is part of what it is to be human and what it is to explore. And I think that has been certainly one of the experiences that I have felt over the last day or so. So, having said that, I hope we haven't felt too uncomfortable, that our discomfort has been temporary and within reason, but nonetheless an uncomfortable experience to a certain extent. Can I ask Migo to come up and give a bit of a summary? I'll give you a few minutes, 3 minutes maybe, maximum, to talk about what was presented, discussed at your group, and then Julia will come up.
Well, 3 minutes. To sum up, I think we realize that there are several limits to our ability to impact current processes. One is the limit of resources in general. Resources going to research and resources to go to practical medicine and real people in the real needs. We also realize that there are limits how to impact the whole process of regulations, both in country but also internationally. And we came back to the issue of informed consent on a meta level, which means that how a public opinion can be informed in order to give a consent or really go ahead and change the law or prohibit some changes if they're there. We had one particular proposal also for the text of that paper. On the first page, paragraph 3, when there is the sentence, accordingly, the topic will be approached by employing analytical framework and so forth. And there's a proposal to add their emotional impact. So we can consider that. And we talked about trust, that society works on the trust and how trust can be developed. It takes time and it's a symbolic very often also. And the final comment maybe about the governance, what type of governance we as citizens, but also as churches, we want over our developing technologies. But we have no final answer here either.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Julia, can I have the microphone? Migo.
So very briefly, we will discuss the purpose of the paper, to whom the documents might be addressed, churches, organization and partnerships, European institutions, or broader. In that case, should it had provide more concrete guidelines and conclusions on what we want to address, while preserving the diversity of opinions. We also raised the weakness, philosophical and theological, of the document, maybe to be more developed. Also, we discussed of the wording, if we should use genome or gene editing. There was also discussion of the ethics as a train which is running, and that we are already involved in this discussion, but also someone asked who is conducting this train. Also, we would like to have more open presentations of what are our feelings and even fears that are present in our churches when dealing with these issues, to be more concrete on the approaches. Is it this document can integrate wider religion debates on the genome editings and how those questions are thought in different religions as well. Also we found out that this, however, religion semantic is there in use in our churches, and that it might be put forward in our societal discussions of genome editings, like, for example, the use of the concept of person, and what do we understand under the concept of person when we are living in the society of individuals. So how we can use already existing concepts and translate it to be more comprehensive for our society. I hope.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Julia. Okay, now I think we have opportunity for some discussion. I think probably we have about half an hour, maybe a little bit longer. We want to try and finish on time. I'm conscious that many of us have got flights to catch. But I think one of the themes that has come through is what to do with the document that we've just been discussing, and with what we've learned over the last couple of days. How do we practically take that forward? What are the practical outcomes for where, as we go back to our different places of work, our places of worship, our countries? How do we take this forward on a practical level? I think might be one of the questions that we might want to think about. So I'm going to open the floor. And is there a microphone for somebody? Yeah, great, thank you. So if there are any questions or points for discussion around perhaps some of the issues that were raised in the groups that you were in, or by the other group, or perhaps more broadly around what we've discussed during the course of our meeting. Luca.
Okay, I have a broad consideration. Listening to the beautiful speech of Professor Lowell Badge, and more in general, listening to all the speeches in these 2 days, I felt a strange sensation. My sensation is that things that are done in the laboratories can no longer be effectively communicated because they are too complicated. Science separates itself from the so-called world of life. Science becomes esoteric. It is no coincidence for me that the theologians' reports have failed to enter into the merits of the scientific questions to be discussed. I permit that mine is not an accusation to theologians. I want to report an epochal difficulty. The difficulty is that esotericism is the opposite of science. Science has by nature a public and rational connotation. When science becomes esoteric, it loses social consensus. The consequences of this fact are twofold. The first is the rebirth of an attitude prejudicial to science. In Italy, in recent months, we are witnessing violent polemics against science on the issue of mandatory vaccination, or vaccinazione obbligatoria, we say in Italian. The second difficulty is the difficulty of imagining an effective and shared way to make decisions. The decisions cannot be left to the experts, we said, because they concern all citizens. But the problem is, how can citizens participate in discussions with such a high level of technicality?
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether anybody wants to come back on any of these issues. Robin, I don't know whether you agree or disagree with what was said, or whether anybody else feels able and willing to contribute.
Just to say, I agree. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to scientists to be able to put things in ways that people can understand them. I mean, a lot of science does, science and technology marches on without any attempt to explain how things work. I have no idea how this works, right? So, okay, my mobile phone. I mean, I know some principles, but I'm a biologist. I'm not able to understand that, and so it's within science, different science disciplines as well. It's an issue. We just have to try harder at translating things in a way that people can understand, because we want people to be involved in the discussions and the debate of what to do with the technology. So it's up to us to try this. Some of us are trying. I mean, we're trying hard, but it's often difficult.
The whole area of science communication is a big issue, but also, Laurence, I think you want to come in here because I think it is important from a legal perspective, because
yes, but on the other hand, what I want to say is that you don't need to be an expert in all these things to have a view. And I think we are all, I mean, maybe Robin is an expert in science, but science is not the only element in the discussions, and is not an expert in other fields where you might argue that you are. And I think it's all relatives. I think we need to have a common understanding, and there is a shared responsibility for those who understand certain things to communicate about those things. But I do believe that you don't need to know exactly whether it's base T or A that needs to be changed there. Those very technical elements are not fundamental to understand and to discuss. I think there is an issue there that the technicality should not be used to hide fundamental questions or to blur them. I think that there are fundamental consequences, and scientists have to say what is currently possible. They have to admit what they don't know. They have to say what they think might be possible, and it's on that basis. How you do it technically, I'm not sure this is the key element in those discussions. You might provide an element, but what I'm saying is that there is a minimum to be known, but the fact that you're not mastering does mean that you should not be part in the discussion, and that's very important.
We've kind of majored on the scientists at this stage, but could a similar criticism be levelled at lawyers or theologians or philosophers?
Well, I mean,
not communicating?
I'm not a lawyer, I'm a scientist, by the way, but anyway.
I know, I wasn't trying to get it.
No, but I think what I see, lawyers work hard on how to interpret legal things that have been adopted. But when it comes to building a consensus, that is different. Lawyer can give some suggestions on how to formulate things, but they are kind of, can I say they are interpreter or translator of something that should be emanating from a discussions. So how do you formulate that And that you need to understand the language of law to see whether actually what is now written exactly reflect what is the outcome of the discussions. And lawyers can be part of the discussion also to explain what is meant behind the existing principle that could still be used as a reference or still be considered as being valid. But again, we are in the multidisciplinarity discussions, and I think the expertise required is to be a citizen, if I may say it that way.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. Mark.
Yes, I just want to say that I agree with what you said, but we don't have institutions for that. It needs institution. If we want really to change something, we have to build a new institution, because institutions of today are just incapable of that. They're not shaped for that. It's impossible. It's you can't bring to the parliament, for instance, questions of the common good, or so. It's just impossible.
I mean, I agree with what you say in that the details are not, the scientific details aren't always necessary, but actually, in a way, sometimes they are, because sometimes they are the balance. And you know, I've interacted with policymakers in the UK in drawing up, for example, amendments to the HFEA Act in 2008, and to do with drawing up the regulations for mitochondrial replacement. And sometimes the way that they write the laws actually ties up things in a way that they shouldn't be tied up. So my plea to lawyers is, people writing the regulations, if you make things a little bit flexible, it'll make everyone's life easier, as long as you've got the intentions that are spelt out. And you know, some of us try and do our bit. So I've got to prepare another talk now for tomorrow evening, because I'm giving a talk at the Royal Society in London. It's sort of a closed meeting, but it's going to be the audience is half scientists and half very senior lawyers and judges. So I'm really scared about this. But again, the intention is to start getting that community thinking about the issues. So.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion on this point, or does somebody else want to raise something else around, perhaps? Yep.
Thank you, Merdo. After 2 days of discussing all these very interesting and crucial topics, the question still is this: can regulations promote ethics? What kind of ethics, and in what context? Because
can regulations promote ethics?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's a provocative question.
Right. Do any of the theologians want to answer that question?
Well, I mean, I could say yes. Normally, they are the outcome of an ethical discussions, but they can embed in themselves mechanisms to constantly have these ethical discussions going on. I mean, to a certain point, the Oviedo Convention tried to do that with the Article 28, asking states to promote this debate. So it's possible to promote at least a mechanism that value ethical discussions. But to promote ethics, I don't know what it is, promoting ethics. You promote the discussions, but ethics for me is not, it's a discussion rather than an answer to a question.
What I want to stress out is that if regulations help us to be ethical, I mean, there is this distinction in theology between ontological ethics and normative ethics. So if you don't throw a paper on the road because you're afraid of the law, does not mean that you are ethical. You're just afraid the law. So the real problem is if we have this ethical culture or the self-reflection and if regulations help us to have this self-reflection, to be better people, to help ourselves and to be in solidarity with the rest of community. So that's the question. If
Ulrik, I think you had something to contribute.
Well, it's just a short comment because I completely agree with Lawrence Lwoff that normally the process would be that there is when a new law is considered, there's a deliberation driven by ethical considerations, values, etc. So then the law that comes out of that reflects the ethical deliberation before that. But on the other hand, I have no doubt that once a law has been passed, it does form ethics, at least in the deliberative sense. Whether it forms it in the ontological sense that you were speaking of is another question. But that a law makes people, so to speak, I have no doubt about that. And that is, of course, also, that holds very significant theological and philosophical implications as well.
Thank you.
I have been thinking during those 2 days our role as churches, because we're pretty much representing different churches here. And I was reminded what Francis Collins wrote and has been speaking about. He's a geneticist and scientist and so forth. What he's saying is that science, including genetics, can describe things, how they work. But theology, or he came to his own Christian convictions through the scientific work. You know, he said that we ultimately, theology or churches or Christians or people who relate somehow to ultimate need to say why things go on at all. You know, why we exist in this world. And I think it goes back to your presentation also, the big picture and so forth. And I think we as churches, we are not here to know everything, but I think we are here to bring us back to this big picture, the great picture. And when I think about Mendel, you know, when he was discovering his first discoveries in genetics, he was kneeling before altar, and then he was kneeling in the yard, and then he was kneeling again before altar and in the yard. And this interaction between two kneelings, he realized that everything is in awe. And I think we need to bring back that type of logic, that we have to be in awe of life. And as Schweitzer said, you know, the fear of life in the bigger picture. And maybe we can help our societies also to keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you. Anybody here? Yeah.
So I think it would be the time of discussing about the value of vulnerability. So we have some very good aspects to solve or making suggestions to solve ethical questions as a non-maleficence, beneficence, precaution, and so. But it's a normative point now, as I think, that could we imagine the human being without any kind of vulnerability? Is it some ontological point of view of being human? Or is it a legal or ethical argumentable target, to think about the people without any vulnerability. So now I think it's a concrete task for maybe for the European institutions and all the churches and maybe the persons too.
Vulnerability. Does anybody want to pick up that baton and discuss issues around vulnerability? I think when we're talking in the biological sciences around what is life, that part of that discussion is vulnerability. The fact that the opposite of life is death, and if something is inanimate or is dead, then that is, it doesn't have the ability to interact with its surroundings in the way that something that is alive is. So the vulnerability to die is part of that discussion, I think. So nobody wants to take that forward at this stage. Yeah.
I will try, because I think if we talk about its vulnerability, part of the human being, this brings us to some theological questions also. Because if we, for example, take Schleiermacher, to name a German theologian, who said, well, to be human is in fact to be absolutely dependent. Yeah, that's what he says, like the fundamental of being, the religious feeling is to feel yourself dependent. Yeah, and this can be described as God, he said. And so it is fundamental of the human being to find yourself in this world without having yourself placed in this world. You were not the one who placed yourself in the world, it's out of your reach. And so if we make the human being the object of our to change it, do we change or are our theological positions still valuable? Do they still work? Or have we changed the perception of ourselves as human beings so far that the columns of our theological thinking aren't working anymore?
Thank you. Okay, anybody want to carry on that discussion or another thread? Does anybody? No? David, I thought you were indicating an interest in. Okay. One of the questions that arose in our group was the train is already moving. Who's driving the train? I think that perhaps might be worth exploring. I think we are moving, but who's deciding where we move and in which direction we're moving?
Okay, I can start on that one. Where I was reflecting, actually, Murdo, was in terms of how the church has dealt with issues in the past. Okay, this one may be different, maybe perhaps more all-embracing in terms of what it's doing, but it's not the first time that the church or churches have had to deal with difficult questions. When IVF first came up, there were questions. When it became possible to do artificial insemination in livestock, there were difficult questions. And as we look back, there have all sorts of questions have come up, and churches have either taken a decision to ignore it and to let society run with wherever they wanted to go, or in some cases they've decided that yes, this did raise either theological issues which needed to be engaged with, or where there was things from theology which actually could help. And so it seemed to me that perhaps we could learn from approaches we've taken in the past to how we might deal with this one. And there was a comment our colleague from Salvation Army was making in the group that I was in this morning about the use of stories. And it seems to me that actually one of the things that the church is actually very good at is actually using story as a way of helping understanding. And of course, clearly, you know, the Bible, a large chunk of it is about the use of story to promote memory, story to promote understanding, story as a vehicle for facilitating discussion. And it seemed to me that if we can produce the right stories in relation to this, and clearly many of the things that Robin was talking about yesterday would lead themselves to quite powerful stories that actually then pose issues as part of them, then perhaps this is something that the church can do to facilitate and to aid discussion in society. So the train may be moving, the train clearly is moving. It's got a degree of speed, but it hasn't reached its final station yet. And so while that train is moving, one of the things that we can do as church is actually to work out where we might produce stories to help people to become edified and educated as the train moves along the track.
Thank you. The use of stories as we move forward. I think that in my role, one of the things that I quite often come up against, particularly in relation to IVF, is questions of pastoral care, the ways in which it plays out, the technology plays out in personal lives, and how whether people have faith or whether people do not, the technologies which are developed aren't applied in a vacuum, that there are real lives and real people involved in how we apply these situations, and we're seeing that with pastoral issues, and that will be more and more the case with genome editing as that progresses.
Thank you for making my day. This was a comment I've been wanting to hear all the time, because I think, with all due respect, I think it's been excellent, this. But everything we've done, form and essence here, has been how they would do that in a scientific conference and not in a church conference. That would be my input, to say we haven't marked the opening of the day, we haven't marked the ending of the day, that kind of issues. And I think that as a sign that secular society and science is marking everything these days. And we as a church need to stand up and say we mark things in a different way. We mark it with a beginning and an end. We mark it with stories. We mark it with pastoral care. Might be different from people to people. These are the kind of voices, I think, where we have something to say, and we should say it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So, mental note, next time we organise a conference, ensure that we mark the beginning and end of the day, and that we do it in a way that honours God. I sense that perhaps we're coming to a natural conclusion. I think there's been real opportunities for us to explore some of the issues, and thank you for all of who've contributed. It's been a real privilege to be here, to be involved with this work and with this group. I'm going to hand over to the captain of our group, and he's going to lead us as we finish. Thank you.
Whether I'm the captain or not, I don't know. If I am, at least I hope I am it in the serving sense, in a proper theological sense, that I have served the reference group in a proper way. But I would like to close this conference here with a few concluding remarks. And first of all, I want to say thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all the participants who have participated in this conference. We've had some very broad, stimulating discussions, and in many ways it is difficult to point to a few conclusions and say, this is what we can conclude from this conference. But we have heard from Robin Lovell-Badger's excellent talks yesterday. We've heard about these new approaches in genome editing, and we've heard one particular argument for them, that they are more precise and more effective, especially the CRISPR related to previous technologies. I remember there was one place where Robin said it was cheaper, it was more simple, it was more specific, more effective. So there are many, in that sense, there are good arguments for the CRISPR. Robin also pointed to some of the concerns, and as he said, this was one of the slides that he went over relatively quickly, and as he said, as longer as we come down the list, the more science fiction it becomes. But some of the immediate concerns are the multi-generational risks, the need for long-term follow-up, and the lack of consent in concerned persons. The more scientific, the more science fiction issues are questions of enhancement and whether we can genetically change ourselves, our descendants. And here we also turn into what Robin called some of the thorny questions. So here there are some of the difficult questions, but also some of the questions that it is difficult to reach a clear answer to, because they are somehow as more somewhat blurry questions, because they are left more in the haze, so to speak. As it is difficult to see what these technologies could imply down the road. After Robin's talk, we heard the presentations both from Peter Dabrock on a Protestant approach to a Lutheran Protestant approach to responsibility. We heard Miltiadis Vansos on the Orthodox concept of theosis and how that could be understood as a concept that in its imitation of the will of God can play a fruitful role in what it means with regard to this concept of playing God. With Bruno Santo, we heard a Catholic argument for maybe moving beyond a more traditional Catholic understanding of natural law. And in some ways, the question, of course, still remains, this whole concept of natural law still is a very central concept in the Catholic tradition. So it was a very interesting talk pointing to new ways of some strands of Catholic theology. In the presentation from Lawrence Loaf from the Council of Europe, we heard about the background for the work of the Council of Europe, and we also had some slides particularly on this Article 13, which is one of the, with regard to the issues that we are discussing at this conference, one of the most central articles, and where it's, you also have it in your material for this program, where it also states that it is only the preventive, diagnostic, and therapeutic purposes that the Oviedo Convention allows for, but not the modification in the genome of descendants. But as we know, it's not all the European countries who have signed this Oviedo Convention. And as we also heard in the talk from Robin Lovell-Badge, there are eight countries allowing research on early human embryos. So there's not a complete, not all countries have ratified the Oviedo Convention, and one of the discussions that we have had during this conference has particularly been with relation to germline genome editing, and not least the formulations of this discussion paper from the Thematic Reference Group, and I will return to that in a couple of minutes. In Mark Hunyadi's talk, we heard what some of the discussions that particularly were raised were with regard to small ethics versus this larger picture. What kind of larger vision of society and ethics can we bring into these ethical discussions, and what is and what kind of ethics serves the purpose, the aim that we would really be striving for, which was a discussion also between Hunyadi and Lawrence Lwoff. So in many ways, we end this conference where we started. We end with still having the most controversial question is still around germline genome editing, and how far can and should we go with relation to genome editing with relation to descendants. And the report of the Thematic Reference Group argues for a prohibition here, and this is in line both with the Oviedo Convention. It is also in line, as we have heard over this conference, with the US report on genome editing. So in many ways you could say that the report as it stands here reflects a general consensus. It's not everybody in the, it's not all the members of the Thematic Reference Group that would agree with these formulations. And it may be that we will make a small adjustment. That has become clear to us over this conference. So this may be some of the small adjustments that we will might be making. But as it stands now, it ends up with this reflection on the difference between what we can do and what we should do. And this is, of course, a classical ethical discussion, and I would just briefly, as a quote, this report, and I still think it's formulated very precisely. Some may argue that humans have a God-given ability to reason, explore, and invent, and thus to not use these techniques when the opportunity arises to do so would be wrong. But just because we can do something, does that mean that we should do it? So it's this classical discussion again between what we can do and what we should do. And then the report continues. As Christians, we're called on to take a wider perspective on the issues which affect us as individuals and as society, and to care for the most vulnerable in our society. These are also some of the discussions that have come up here this morning, who may not be able to speak for themselves. We would strongly urge that national and international prohibitions be put on the use of gene editing or genome editing to alter the human germline and to seek a more socially just and less risky solution to the environmental, social, and health problems being addressed. And I know this is controversial, and this is something that we have been discussing over the conference. I can just say that these lines do reflect the general views of the Thematic Reference Group. They do reflect the views of the Oviedo. They do reflect the US report on genome editing. So, and I hear, of course, some of the arguments for softening these formulations, but as they stand, they are an expression of a broad agreement. And of course, these lines also touch upon this term of the human condition, and this is a term that has also popped up now and then over this conference, mostly with relation to improving the human conditions. So do the technologies of genome editing, do they hold potential of improving the human condition, has been one of the questions that we have addressed. One of the aspects of this that we have not addressed so much during this conference is whether these technologies also lead to a relieving the human condition, because there is an element here of the human being as a fragile, dependent, and vulnerable a human being, and there is an importance here in maintaining that limitation, fragility, and vulnerability of the human being, where this whole discussion ties into where are the how do we respect that? How do we come to terms with being limited, vulnerable human beings? And this is, of course, where these debates also lead into fundamental theological issues. So this is where some of the questions of this conference continue to be controversial also after we close today. Where the discussions seem to be less controversial, and I think this has also been clear during this conference, is with regard to some of the potentials of genome editing with regard to somatic genome editing. It may be more expensive. It may have a longer perspective before it can be taken into clinical use. But from an ethical, theological, philosophical perspective, these potentials of the somatic genome editing seem far less controversial, and in that sense also more promising, even if I do acknowledge that here there is also, at least from some parts of the scientific community, a wish to go further than that. So with some of these last comments and with a gratitude for the inspiring discussions and talks that we have had, I will give the word now to Søren with a small presentation to the speakers and to Julia. But for my part, I will now say thank you very much for these 2 days and wish you a safe travels, and then there will of course be lunch here immediately after. But now, please, Søren.
Thank you. I see you're fresh, and I can continue with a speech of about 1 hour. No, I think I've got the honor to make the conclusion, a short conclusion. I started with the Golem and Frankenstein, and I just to termine as well with the Golem and Frankenstein. It reminds me after the speech of John Batch that very popular television series in France, and at the end were for kids, and at the end they were always saying, "Don't try this at home." So don't try this at home. One thing which is much serious, and I thank Laurence, education for democratic citizenship and bioethics are one of the main themes at the Council of Europe. And I think they are linked together. We spoke about this. Education is not only to explain something, to transfer knowledge, but it's a discourse. We are discussing, we try to understand, and we've got the ability to relativize things. And we in church, we have got, I think with storytelling, as you thought it was the stories, we've got the ability or the capacity to tell stories, to educate in many things. Churches, we as Christians, we have another thing. We know that the future, we can't make it. We can contribute, but the future, and I think, thank you for the contribution of Schleiermacher, which I like very much, the future is not in our hands. And I think this, to acknowledge this, it's very important. But we have to contribute to create future, but in the end, it's not in our hands. So thank you for this very, very rich conference. Thank you for you all. And I've got something sweet. It's not alcohol. We're now in Lent time, so I think the cake, we are, I think, a little bit cautious with this. But I've got a small present from Alsace, not wine, but chocolate. So thank you, and I first, yes, if you, I go round.